Colin, the notion of self, is that a legitimate idea that we can hang on to? I mean, I feel like I know what the I inside of me is. Is the self something real or something that's an artificial construct?
I think the self is something real. There are many different interpretations of the idea of the self or the idea of the person. If you think of the self or the person as the organism, then it's obviously real, but then it's not terribly problematic. So we can understand the identity of an organism like a cat or a dog or a human being over time. Some philosophers have distinguished between the concept of a human being and the concept of a person, and they mean by the concept of a person something much more psychological. So if we shift to the idea of a subject of consciousness, so the thing which is aware of what I'm now aware of as I experience the world, that becomes a lot more problematic, and it's not clear what constitutes that. And it's easy to have all sorts of fantasies about what kind of thing that might be and what it's capable of. So, you know, in world religions and world traditions, cells can survive death and be reincarnated in other bodies and other species and so on. They can move from one person to another. They can do all sorts of leave the body and so on. So the idea of the self in that psychological sense seems a very magical and strange concept. I think that all those ideas should be discounted. Selves can't do those kinds of things. Though I think it's understandable that our imagination might lead us to have those thoughts. What I would say is the self has got to be grounded in the brain. Its unity at a time and over time must be a function of what's in the brain. We don't know how that works, but it must be so. And our imaginative adventures with the concept reflect our ignorance about what the self actually is and what constituted in the brain. So we run away with the idea and we think all sorts of things are really possible, which if we knew the truth about the self, we wouldn't think were possible. But our grasp on the concept of the self is very limited because we experience it from our first-person point of view. We say I, but we don't really know what that thing is at all, except as the bearer of these mental states. And so it seems something very elusive and almost something both simple and complex at the same time, and ontologically extremely bizarre.
So the self is then the sum total of or an integration of all my conscious states in some way?
Well, that's a Humean view, and it's, again, a very natural view to take. Instead of thinking of the self as the substance or the entity which has these conscious states, but separate from them, it's constituted by the conscious states. Right. So Hume thought in the case of identity over time. But identity over time is a series of relations between mental states, which are causally connected, and connected by similarity and connected by memory and so on. And because of those relations, we say there's a self existing over time. The problem with that is it seems too thin to ground the idea of personal identity as you existed at an earlier time and you, the self-same thing, exists at a later time. All we've got is the idea that you at a later time are causally connected to you at an earlier time. Right. That isn't the same thing as you're persisting through time. Right. So when we try to get the idea of what it is for a self to persist through time, we start getting pushed towards the idea of a simple substance which underlies our mental states. But that is a completely mysterious idea and to me is not a good idea.
Well, that pushes people towards traditional dualism. Because every molecule in my body is different than the 5-year-old child who grew up in New York City.
Yeah.
Every single molecule is different.
Yeah. Well, so we have to think of the self as something which emerges from or depends on the molecules of the body, and its identity doesn't depend on the identity of the molecules of the body. That's actually not so bad, that conclusion, because after all, the identity of an individual organism, even like a cat, it's the same cat you've got throughout a period of time, even though its body will be composed of completely different molecules at one time than another time.
There's a causal connection.
Because of the causal connections. Yeah. What's much more troubling, though, is to try to make sense of the self as this psychological thing which is the bearer of these mental states. Because that's something where we seem to be able to have the idea, say, of survival of death. We seem to have that idea. I think that's not a coherent idea. But we can't really say very much about it because we don't know the nature of the self.
But it's so pandemic in human species across time and across cultures.
It is. So I'm really pouring some cold water on those ideas because people think, people imagine the self to be capable of all sorts of strange things, rather supernatural things, where it can exist independently of the brain, for example. I'm saying that arises wholly from the fact of our ignorance of how the self is rooted in the brain. If we could understand how the self is rooted in the brain, it must be rooted somehow. We wouldn't think it to be independent of the brain. We only think there's a contingent connection between the self and the brain, because we don't understand the nature of the necessary connection between them. So that's the problem with the idea of the self. But the issue is extremely difficult because we don't have any clear conception of what this thing is. We have a very thin conception. It's just the idea of I. If you say to somebody, well, tell me more about the thing you refer to as I can say to you, as one of Hume's famous points, I can tell you what's going on in that self right now, what ideas the self has.
Right.
If you say, no, I don't want to know about that, I want to know what the self is.
There's nothing left over.
There's nothing left over. You don't encounter it in introspection. You don't perceive it in somebody else. You only perceive their body. It seems a kind of receding, transcendent thing that is capable of strange feats.
The odd thing about the self is that the more you're thinking about it, the more you're pushed to the absolute extremes. Either there is some sort of a mystical, supernatural dualism, or there's no such thing as self. It's just an artificial construct of all the different perceptions that we have. And
That's right.
And you,
That's right.
you know, both of those seem fairly coherent, and yet they're
right.
exactly the opposite.
That's right. You seem to be driven toward the supernaturalist irreducibility view to avoid the eliminativist view, where there isn't any such thing as the self. The human view is really eliminativist.
Yeah.
It says,
but I can
really
subscribe to that too.
You can oscillate from one to the other.
Yeah.
They can't both be true, of course.
It can't be always true.
You can go from
But I'm
one to
more
the other.
comfortable at one extreme or the other than any place in between. That's the odd thing.
That is the odd thing. I'm trying to give an account of that unsatisfactory intellectual predicament by saying, well, the reason you feel that you have to occupy the role of the irreducible ego, the transcendent thing that can survive death,
or eliminating it altogether.
Or eliminating it altogether, is because you just don't know what it is.
Yes.
If you understood what it was, you'd say, well, it's just this. It's not this thing that can do all these bizarre things. It's something which is, look, it's quite understandable how it relates to the brain. You know, it can only exist with the brain. Its unity results from these properties of the brain, whatever they may be. And it's just an illusion that it has these possibilities that we think it has. So I think in the case of the self, even more than consciousness, our imagination is something which is liberated in a bad sense by our ignorance. We think that various things are possible, which aren't really possible for the self. Just as we might in the material world, when we knew very little about the material world, things might seem to us to be possible, which when we understand the physics and the chemistry more, we'll see that they aren't really possible. So ignorance gives rise to false imaginings.